The mahogany chess set gleamed under the crystal chandelier of the Blackwood Tower's penthouse office, each piece carved from African blackwood and ivory, worth more than most people's annual salaries. Marcus Blackwood adjusted his Italian silk tie and surveyed the board with the satisfaction of a man who had never lost at anything that mattered. The tech mogul's empire stretched across 3 continents, his net worth floating somewhere in the stratosphere of 12 figures. Yet tonight he found himself making a wager that would either cement his reputation as untouchable or shatter it completely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Across from him sat Elena Martinez, 19 years old, her calloused hands folded quietly in her lap as she studied the board with an intensity that seemed to burn through the expensive veneer of the room. Her jeans were faded, her sneakers worn thin at the edges, and her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail that revealed the determined set of her jaw. She was the daughter of Carmen Martinez, who had cleaned these very floors for the past 15 years, scrubbing away the footprints of titans of industry, while her daughter studied chess theory in the service elevator during school breaks. The challenge had been born from arrogance and coincidence in equal measure. Marcus had been entertaining potential investors from Singapore, men whose pockets ran as deep as his own, when Carmen had accidentally knocked over a decorative chess set while dusting the conference room. As the pieces scattered across the Persian rug, her daughter Elena had quickly gathered them up, placing each piece back in its correct starting position without hesitation, her movements precise and confident, despite the obvious embarrassment burning in her cheeks. One of the investors, an elderly man named Chen Wei, who had built his fortune in shipping and real estate, noticed the girl's swift accuracy and commented with amusement that she seemed to know the game. Marcus had laughed, a sound both patronizing and dismissive, suggesting that knowing where pieces belonged was hardly the same as understanding the sophisticated strategies that separated chess masters from mere enthusiasts. Elena had looked up then, her brown eyes flashing with something between hurt and defiance, and in that moment she had made a choice that would alter the trajectory of several lives. The words that tumbled from her lips were quiet but clear, cutting through the awkward silence like a blade through silk. She challenged him to a game, right there in front of his distinguished guests, with the scattered pieces still warm from her careful hands. The room had gone silent, the kind of profound quiet that precedes either a storm or a revelation. Marcus had stared at this girl, this child of his employee, this nobody from nowhere, and felt something that had been foreign to him for decades, genuine surprise. His first instinct had been to dismiss her outright, to suggest she return to whatever homework or teenage concerns occupied her time, while the adults conducted business. But Chen Wei had leaned forward in his chair, his weathered face creasing into a smile that suggested he found the entire situation deeply entertaining. The old man had always believed that character revealed itself most clearly when people thought no one important was watching, and something about this exchange had captured his attention completely. Before Marcus could deflect or change the subject, Chen Wei had made the suggestion that would prove both irresistible and catastrophic. A wager, $10 million. If this girl, this child who smelled of discount detergent and carried herself with the careful dignity of those who understood the weight of other people's expectations, could defeat Marcus Blackwood in a single game of chess, she would walk away richer than most people dared to dream. If she lost, which everyone in the room except perhaps Elena herself seemed to consider inevitable, she would disappear from their world entirely, along with her mother, never to return to the Blackwood Tower or any property associated with the Blackwood Empire. Marcus had accepted the terms with the casual confidence of a man who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with superior resources, strategic thinking, and the simple assumption that he was fundamentally better than most people at most things. Chess was a game he had mastered in prep school, refined at Harvard, and used as both recreation and psychological warfare throughout his business career. He owned first edition chess texts that cost more than Elena's family made in 6 months, had played exhibition matches with grandmasters at charity galas, and possessed a collection of vintage chess sets that museums frequently requested to borrow for special exhibitions. What he had not anticipated, what none of them had fully grasped in that moment of wealthy men making casual bets with other people's lives, was that Elena Martinez had been studying chess with the desperate focus of someone who understood that knowledge might be the only pathway out of a life circumscribed by other people's low expectations. While her classmates had spent their afternoons at the mall or scrolling through social media, Elena had haunted the public library, devouring every chess book on the shelves, memorizing opening sequences and endgame scenarios with the methodical precision of someone who knew she would likely get only one chance to prove herself. Her education had begun 6 years earlier, when she discovered an abandoned chess set in the community center's lost and found box. Half the pieces were missing, the board was warped from water damage, and one of the knights had been partially chewed by what appeared to be either a very large dog or a very small child. But Elena had taken the damaged set home, carved replacement pieces from soap bars stolen from the Blackwood Tower's supply closet, and taught herself the rules using a tattered chess manual she found at a garage sale for 50 cents. Carmen Martinez had watched her daughter's obsession with a mixture of pride and concern. She understood the hunger in Elena's eyes, the way the girl's fingers moved restlessly when she was thinking through complex positions, the manner in which she would mutter move sequences under her breath while folding laundry or washing dishes. Carmen had grown up poor in El Salvador, had crossed 2 borders and learned 3 new languages in pursuit of opportunities that always seemed to hover just beyond her reach, and she recognized in her daughter the same burning ambition that had carried her through decades of pre-dawn shifts and aching knees. But Carmen also understood the world in ways that Elena, despite her intelligence and determination, had not yet fully grasped. She knew how men like Marcus Blackwood viewed people like them, how easily the powerful could crush the aspirations of those who dared to reach beyond their designated place in the social hierarchy. When Elena had called that evening to explain the wager, Carmen had felt her stomach drop with a familiar dread, the same sensation she experienced whenever one of her employers looked at her with the cold calculation of someone deciding whether she was worth the trouble of keeping around. The news of the challenge had spread through the Blackwood Tower's employee network with the speed and intensity of wildfire. Janitors whispered about it in supply closets, security guards discussed it during shift changes, and administrative assistants exchanged meaningful glances across conference rooms where they served coffee to executives who remained oblivious to the drama unfolding in the margins of their important lives. For many of these workers, Elena represented something both inspiring and terrifying, the possibility that one of them might actually have the chance to strike back at the system that kept them invisible and expendable. Marcus spent the 3 days leading up to the match in his usual fashion, alternating between dismissive confidence and obsessive preparation. He reviewed his favorite openings, consulted with his personal chess coach via video call, and even went so far as to research Elena's background, though he found little beyond her academic transcripts and the basic employment records of her mother. What he discovered should have given him pause. Elena maintained a perfect grade point average despite working 20 hours per week at a local bookstore, had won her high school's chess tournament 3 years running, and possessed a library card that showed she had checked out over 200 chess books in the past year alone. Instead, Marcus interpreted these details as evidence of Elena's limitations rather than her potential. In his experience, truly gifted individuals didn't need to work so hard to achieve excellence. They simply possessed it naturally, the way he had always possessed wealth, connections, and the unshakable belief that the universe had arranged itself for his benefit. The idea that someone might actually become formidable through study and determination, rather than inherent superiority, struck him as both quaint and ultimately irrelevant. Elena spent those same 3 days in a state of controlled terror and fierce preparation. She replayed thousands of games in her mind, visualizing board positions until they appeared behind her closed eyelids with crystalline clarity. She practiced breathing exercises learned from a library book about performance anxiety, forced herself to eat regular meals despite the nausea that seemed to live permanently in her throat, and tried not to think about what would happen to her mother if she lost. The weight of representing not just herself but everyone who had ever been underestimated pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. She thought about her mother's swollen feet after 12-hour shifts, about her own carefully hidden dreams of college and graduate school, and a life where she might be valued for her intelligence rather than apologized for because of her circumstances. She thought about every time someone had looked through her as if she were invisible, every conversation that had stopped when she entered a room, every assumption that had been made about her capabilities based on her zip code and her family's tax bracket. The night before the match, Elena sat in her family's cramped apartment above the corner market, surrounded by chess books borrowed from 3 different library systems and photocopied pages from strategy guides she couldn't afford to purchase. The kitchen table was covered with handwritten notes, diagrams of complex positions, and index cards filled with tactical patterns she had memorized through countless hours of repetition. Carmen watched her daughter from the doorway, seeing in Elena's intense concentration an echo of her own younger self, the woman who had believed that working hard enough could overcome any obstacle. Carmen had wanted to tell her daughter to forfeit, to walk away from a game where the stakes were designed to destroy them regardless of the outcome. Even if Elena won, Carmen understood that men like Marcus Blackwood didn't simply accept defeat from people they considered beneath them. There would be consequences, complications, ways of ensuring that their victory was transformed into just another kind of loss. But when she looked at Elena's face, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent light, and marked by a determination that seemed to radiate from somewhere deeper than mere ambition, Carmen knew that asking her daughter to surrender would be like asking her to stop breathing. Instead, Carmen made her daughter a cup of tea using the good china they saved for special occasions, sat down across from her at the cluttered table, and began to tell stories. Stories about Elena's grandmother, who had taught herself to read using discarded newspapers and had become the unofficial letter writer for her entire village. Stories about Elena's great-uncle, who had built a successful carpentry business despite never learning to read blueprints, who instead possessed an intuitive understanding of wood and space that architects with advanced degrees couldn't match. Stories about intelligence that lived in places where credentials couldn't reach, about strength that grew in the spaces between what people expected and what was actually possible. Elena listened while moving chess pieces through complex sequences, her hands working independently of her conscious mind as her mother's voice wrapped around her like a protective charm. The stories reminded her that she came from a long line of people who had found ways to triumph despite being systematically underestimated, people who had learned to transform disadvantage into hidden advantage, who had discovered that being invisible sometimes meant you could see things that others missed entirely. As the night deepened and the city's sounds softened into the gentle hum of distant traffic and settling buildings, Elena felt something shift inside her chest. The fear didn't disappear, but it transformed into something sharper and more useful, a blade of focus that cut through doubt and hesitation.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She was no longer the daughter of a maid who cleaned floors for rich men's amusement. She was a chess player, perhaps not the most naturally gifted or extensively trained, but certainly one of the most motivated people who had ever approached a chessboard with the understanding that a single game might determine the entire future trajectory of her life. When Marcus arrived at his office the following evening, he found that word of the challenge had somehow leaked beyond the building's employee network. Representatives from 2 chess organizations had requested permission to observe. A journalist from the business section of the city's largest newspaper was stationed in the lobby, and someone had even set up a small crowd of supporters outside the building.
many of them carrying signs with Elena's name and holding candles in a display of solidarity that Marcus found both touching and irritating. The penthouse office had been transformed for the occasion. The usual furniture had been pushed against the walls to create an open space in the center of the room, where the magnificent chess set waited on a table of polished rosewood. Additional lighting had been installed to ensure that every move would be clearly visible to the small audience of observers, investors, and building employees who had been granted permission to witness what many were already calling the most unusual business wager in recent memory. Elena arrived precisely on time, accompanied by her mother, who wore her best dress and carried herself with the dignified bearing of someone who understood that her presence at this event was both unprecedented and potentially revolutionary. Carmen had never been invited to the penthouse as anything other than cleaning staff, had never been expected to sit down at the gleaming conference table or accept a glass of mineral water from the same crystal pitcher that served Marcus's most important guests. Marcus watched Elena approach the chessboard with the analytical gaze he typically reserved for potential business acquisitions or new technology investments. She moved with careful deliberation, her posture straight but not rigid, her expression calm despite what he assumed must be overwhelming nervousness. She wore dark slacks and a white button-down shirt that Carmen had pressed with extra care that morning, clothing that was perfectly appropriate but couldn't disguise the fact that it had been purchased at a discount store and had already been worn to multiple job interviews and school presentations. What Marcus failed to notice, what his assumptions and prejudices prevented him from seeing clearly, was the quality of Elena's attention as she examined the board. She didn't touch the pieces or fidget with nervous energy the way he had expected. Instead, she simply looked, her gaze moving systematically across the board, as if she were reading a complex text written in a language that only she fully understood. Her breathing was steady, her hands were still, and her eyes held the kind of focused intensity that Marcus had previously associated only with fellow business executives during high-stakes negotiations. Chen Wei settled into his chair with obvious anticipation, his aged face brightening with the prospect of witnessing something genuinely unpredictable. The other observers arranged themselves around the room's periphery, maintaining a respectful silence that seemed to acknowledge the gravity of what was about to unfold. Carmen found a seat near the window where she could see her daughter's profile, while also maintaining a clear view of Marcus's face, understanding that this evening would be as much about reading expressions and managing psychological pressure as it would be about chess strategy. Marcus gestured toward the board with what he intended as magnanimous courtesy, indicating that Elena should choose her color and make the opening move. In chess, playing white provides a slight statistical advantage since the player moves first and can therefore control the initial direction of the game, a detail that Marcus assumed Elena might not fully understand. He expected her to accept white pieces eagerly, perhaps even gratefully, as if his willingness to allow her this small advantage represented genuine sportsmanship rather than calculated condescension. Elena studied the board for a long moment, her gaze moving between the white and black pieces with the careful consideration of someone making a decision that extended far beyond mere game mechanics. When she finally looked up at Marcus, her expression was unreadable, a mask of polite professionalism that revealed nothing about her internal calculations or emotional state. She chose black. The decision surprised Marcus, though he tried not to let his confusion show on his face. Choosing to play black meant accepting a slight disadvantage from the game's opening move, something that seemed counterintuitive for someone whose entire future depended on winning this single contest. He wondered if Elena simply didn't understand the strategic implications of color selection, or if she was perhaps too nervous to think clearly about such technical details. What Marcus couldn't have known was that Elena had spent weeks studying his previous games, analyzing footage from charity tournaments and exhibition matches that had been posted online by various chess organizations and society photographers. She had identified patterns in his play, tendencies and preferences that revealed themselves most clearly when he held the initiative and could dictate the game's early development. Elena had discovered that Marcus played his strongest chess when he felt completely in control, when he could execute familiar opening sequences and maneuver his opponents into positions where his superior knowledge of standard tactical patterns would provide decisive advantages. By choosing black, Elena was deliberately ceding the opening initiative, while simultaneously denying Marcus the psychological comfort of his preferred setup. She would have to respond to his moves rather than implementing her own preferred strategies, but she would also force him to commit to specific plans before revealing her own intentions. It was a gamble based on her assessment that Marcus's confidence might actually be his greatest weakness, that his assumption of inevitable victory might cause him to overlook subtle defensive resources and counter-attacking possibilities that a more cautious opponent would never provide. Marcus arranged his pieces with practiced efficiency, his fingers moving across the board with the smooth confidence of someone who had performed these same movements thousands of times in similar settings. He had decided to open with his favorite sequence, a classical development that had served him well in countless previous games against opponents who ranged from business rivals to professional chess masters. The opening was sound, well understood, and would quickly lead to the kind of complex middle game positions where his extensive knowledge of tactical patterns and strategic principles would provide clear advantages over a less experienced player. Elena watched his initial moves with the focused attention of someone reading a document that might contain either salvation or destruction. She recognized the opening immediately, had studied dozens of games that began with similar piece arrangements, and understood both the strengths and potential weaknesses of Marcus's chosen approach. Her response was swift but not rushed, each move flowing naturally from her preparation while also serving multiple strategic purposes that wouldn't become apparent until much later in the game. The early exchanges proceeded according to well-established theoretical principles, with both players developing their pieces toward the center of the board and preparing for the more complex battles that would emerge once the opening phase concluded. Marcus felt comfortable with the position, recognizing familiar patterns and strategic themes that aligned perfectly with his preferred style of play. He had succeeded in achieving the kind of balanced but slightly superior position that typically provided excellent winning chances against opponents who lacked his depth of experience in similar situations. Elena's play during these opening moves appeared cautious, almost timid, as if she were primarily concerned with avoiding immediate tactical disasters rather than pursuing any active winning chances. Marcus interpreted this approach as confirmation of his initial assessment. Elena might possess basic chess competence, but she clearly lacked the aggressive instincts and calculating ability necessary to compete effectively against someone with his credentials and experience. He began to relax slightly, allowing himself to consider how he might convert his emerging positional advantages into decisive material gains during the middle game. What Marcus failed to recognize was that Elena's apparent caution masked a sophisticated understanding of the position's deeper strategic requirements. Rather than pursuing immediate tactical complications that might favor Marcus's superior pattern recognition and calculating speed, Elena was methodically improving her position while creating subtle weaknesses in Marcus's pawn structure and piece coordination. Her moves looked passive on the surface but were actually building toward long-term strategic goals that wouldn't become apparent until the position reached critical mass. The transformation began around the 15th move, when Elena introduced a pawn sacrifice that Marcus had to accept in order to avoid falling into a clearly inferior position. The sacrifice appeared to give Marcus exactly what he wanted, a material advantage, and increased central control that should have provided clear paths toward victory. Marcus accepted the offered pawn with satisfaction, congratulating himself on having successfully navigated Elena's desperate attempt at complication. Elena's follow-up moves revealed the sacrifice's true purpose. Rather than desperately trying to regain her sacrificed material, she used the temporary pawn deficit to accelerate her piece development and create dynamic pressure against Marcus's increasingly exposed king position. The pawn sacrifice had served as a catalyst for piece activity, transforming Elena's previously passive position into a dynamic attacking setup that began to generate concrete threats against Marcus's carefully constructed defenses. Marcus felt the first stirring of genuine concern as he realized that Elena's position was becoming more dangerous than he had initially calculated. The threats were still manageable, certainly, but they required more careful attention than he had expected to devote at this stage of the game. He began to calculate more deeply, spending additional time on each move as he sought to neutralize Elena's initiative while maintaining his material advantage and long-term winning chances. Elena's play became increasingly confident as the position opened up and her pieces found optimal squares from which to create multiple threats simultaneously. She was no longer the nervous teenager who had challenged him in front of his investors. She had transformed into a focused competitor who seemed to understand the position's complexities with startling clarity. Her moves began to flow more quickly, not because she was calculating less deeply, but because the position's requirements had become intuitively clear to her. The psychological dynamic in the room began to shift as the observers realized that what they had expected to be a brief demonstration of superior skill was evolving into something far more competitive and unpredictable. Chen Wei leaned forward in his chair, his experienced eyes tracking the piece movements with growing interest. The other investors and building employees maintained their respectful silence, but the quality of their attention had changed from polite obligation to genuine engagement with the unfolding battle. Carmen watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and terror, recognizing in Elena's body language the same intense concentration that had characterized her study sessions over the past several years. Elena's posture had straightened, her movements had become more decisive, and her eyes held a brightness that Carmen associated with moments when her daughter encountered problems that truly engaged her analytical abilities. For the first time since arriving at the penthouse, Carmen began to allow herself the dangerous luxury of hoping that Elena might actually have a chance of winning. Marcus found himself spending significantly more time on his moves as the position grew more complex and Elena's threats became more difficult to calculate precisely. He was still objectively better, he assured himself still possessed the material advantage and superior pawn structure that should eventually prove decisive.
But Elena's pieces were becoming increasingly active, and several of his own pieces were beginning to feel awkwardly placed as she maneuvered her forces with surprising tactical precision. The critical moment arrived on the 23rd move, when Elena offered a second sacrifice that Marcus spent nearly 15 minutes analyzing before reluctantly concluding that he had no choice but to accept. This sacrifice was even more puzzling than the first, offering Elena no apparent compensation beyond slightly increased piece activity and theoretical pressure against Marcus's king position. Marcus accepted the sacrifice with growing confidence, reasoning that Elena was simply becoming desperate as she realized the hopelessness of her overall strategic situation. Elena's response was immediate and devastating. Rather than retreating or consolidating as Marcus had expected, she launched a precisely calculated attack that seemed to emerge from nowhere, her previously scattered pieces suddenly working together with lethal coordination. The attack wasn't based on hope or desperation, but on concrete tactical calculations that Elena had been preparing for several moves, using her sacrifices to create the exact position where such an attack would prove irresistible. Marcus stared at the board with growing alarm as he realized that Elena's attack was far stronger than he had initially assessed. His king position, which had seemed secure just moments earlier, was suddenly exposed to multiple threats that he couldn't adequately address with his available pieces. The material advantages he had accumulated through Elena's sacrifices had come at the cost of piece coordination and king safety, weaknesses that Elena was now exploiting with surgical precision. For the first time in the game, Marcus found himself genuinely worried about the outcome. Elena's attack was gaining momentum with each move, and his defensive resources were proving inadequate to stem the mounting pressure.
He began to calculate desperately, searching for defensive formations that might allow him to weather the storm and eventually convert his material advantages into a winning endgame position. Elena pressed her attack with relentless precision, each move building on the previous one while creating new threats that Marcus couldn't adequately address. Her pieces moved with perfect coordination, occupying key squares and controlling critical lines with the kind of tactical harmony that Marcus had previously associated only with master-level play. The teenager who had seemed nervous and outclassed during the opening moves had disappeared entirely, replaced by a player who seemed to understand the position's requirements with absolute clarity. The room had grown completely silent except for the soft sound of pieces being placed on squares and the occasional sharp intake of breath from observers who recognized the increasing strength of Elena's attack. Even Chen Wei, whose long business career had accustomed him to maintaining diplomatic neutrality in all circumstances, was struggling to suppress a smile as he watched Elena's pieces weave an increasingly tight net around Marcus's exposed king. Marcus's moves were becoming slower and more labored as he realized that his defensive options were rapidly diminishing. Each of Elena's moves seemed to create multiple new threats while simultaneously eliminating potential escape routes for his endangered king. He found himself calculating variations that led to forced mate, searching desperately for defensive resources that seemed to evaporate under closer examination. The end came with shocking suddenness. Elena moved her queen to a square that Marcus had previously dismissed as harmless, and suddenly he could see the tactical sequence that would lead to unavoidable mate within 3 moves. His king had no escape squares, his defensive pieces were scattered uselessly across the board, and Elena's attack had reached the point where resistance was not merely futile but mathematically impossible. Marcus stared at the board for a full minute, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were showing him. He had lost. Not only had he lost, but he had been systematically outplayed by an opponent he had dismissed as fundamentally inferior. The material advantages he had accumulated meant nothing in the face of Elena's superior understanding of the position's dynamic requirements. His extensive theoretical knowledge and years of experience had proved inadequate against Elena's precise calculation and strategic vision. Elena sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for Marcus to make his final move or acknowledge the inevitable. She showed no signs of triumphant celebration, no indication that she considered her victory anything other than the logical conclusion of a game she had approached with complete seriousness and respect. Her calm professionalism in the moment of victory was perhaps more unsettling to Marcus than any amount of gloating would have been. The silence in the room stretched out until Chen Wei cleared his throat gently and spoke the words that everyone present was thinking but no one had dared to voice. The game was over. Elena had won. Marcus Blackwood, master of the universe, had been defeated by a 19-year-old girl whose mother cleaned his floors and whose entire future had depended on this single contest of skill and will. Marcus's hand trembled slightly as he reached out to tip over his king, the traditional gesture of surrender that would officially end the game and acknowledge Elena's victory. The small wooden piece fell onto its side with a sound that seemed to echo through the penthouse like thunder, carrying with it the weight of assumptions challenged and expectations overturned. Elena had won $10 million, but more importantly, she had won something that couldn't be measured in monetary terms. She had proven that intelligence and determination could triumph over privilege and prejudice, that careful preparation and strategic thinking could overcome apparently insurmountable disadvantages. In defeating Marcus at his own game, she had validated not only her own abilities but the potential of everyone who had ever been underestimated based on their circumstances rather than their capabilities. Carmen felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched her daughter maintain her composed dignity in the face of this life-changing victory. Elena had not merely won a chess game, she had opened a door that had been locked to people like them for generations, had proven that the barriers between different worlds were not as solid as those in power would have everyone believe. The little girl who had learned chess using soap-carved pieces had just defeated one of the most powerful men in the city, and in doing so had transformed from an invisible servant's daughter into someone who could no longer be ignored or dismissed. The observers in the room seemed frozen by the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. The building employees looked at Elena with expressions of awe and vindication, seeing in her victory a validation of their own worth and potential. The investors and business associates struggled to process the implications of Marcus's defeat, understanding that the story of this game would spread far beyond the confines of the penthouse office and potentially reshape how the business community viewed both Marcus's judgment and their own assumptions about who deserved to be taken seriously. Marcus himself remained motionless, staring at his fallen king, as if the small piece might suddenly right itself and allow him to continue playing. The defeat was so complete, so unexpected, that he seemed unable to fully grasp its reality. Everything he had believed about himself, about the natural order of success and failure, about the relationship between privilege and capability, had been challenged in the space of a single evening by someone he had never considered capable of threatening his carefully constructed sense of superiority. As the reality of Elena's victory began to settle over the room like dust after an explosion, it became clear that this was more than just the conclusion of an unusual wager. It was the beginning of something new, something that would ripple outward from this moment and touch lives in ways that none of them could yet fully comprehend. Elena Martinez, the maid's daughter, had defeated the billionaire at his own game, and in doing so had proven that the distance between different worlds might be smaller than anyone had dared to imagine. The morning after Elena's victory broke across the city like a wave finding unexpected cracks in a seawall. By 8 o'clock, 3 major news networks had picked up the story, transforming what should have been a private wager between individuals into a public spectacle that neither Elena nor her mother had anticipated. The headlines ranged from admiringly sensational to barely concealed skeptical, but they all carried the same underlying narrative that made Carmen's stomach twist with familiar dread: the maid's daughter who had dared to defeat her betters. Elena sat at their kitchen table, surrounded by newspapers that neighbors had brought over throughout the early morning hours, each one carrying variations of her photograph taken the previous evening as she left the Blackwood Tower. In some images she looked confident, even victorious, but in others the camera had captured her exhaustion and the overwhelming nature of what she had accomplished. Carmen studied her daughter's face across the breakfast table and saw something that troubled her more than the media attention or even the $10 million that supposedly awaited Elena's claim. Elena looked lost. The victory that should have felt like liberation instead seemed to have created a new kind of prison, one constructed from expectations and scrutiny that Elena had never experienced before. The phone had been ringing constantly since 6 in the morning, with calls from reporters, lawyers, financial advisors, and people claiming to represent various opportunities that Elena might want to consider now that she possessed both wealth and notoriety. Carmen had unplugged the phone after the 15th call, but she could see the anxiety building behind Elena's eyes as the magnitude of her changed circumstances became increasingly apparent. The first concrete sign of trouble arrived in the form of a knock on their apartment door at 9:30. Carmen opened it to find a man in an expensive suit holding a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of smile that she had learned to distrust during her years of navigating bureaucratic systems designed to help people like her as little as possible. He introduced himself as Richard Hawthorne, representing the legal interests of Marcus Blackwood, and requested a moment to discuss some complications that had arisen regarding the previous evening's wager. Elena looked up from the newspaper she had been pretending to read and felt her stomach drop as she recognized the tone in Hawthorne's voice. It was the same carefully controlled politeness that she had heard from school administrators when they were about to explain why certain opportunities weren't really available to students from her background, the same false courtesy that preceded explanations about why things that seemed straightforward were actually much more complicated than they appeared. Hawthorne settled into the chair that Carmen offered him, his gaze moving systematically around the apartment in a way that Elena found both insulting and intimidating. She could see him cataloguing details, the second-hand furniture, the carefully maintained but obviously aging appliances, the stack of library books on chess theory that still occupied one corner of the living room. He was building a case in his mind, she realized, assembling ammunition for whatever attack he was preparing to launch against her victory. The conversation that followed confirmed Elena's worst fears while simultaneously revealing legal complexities that she had never considered. Hawthorne explained that wagers of such magnitude required specific documentation and witnesses to be legally enforceable, standards that their informal agreement had not met. Furthermore, he continued with increasing confidence, there were questions about whether Elena had been truthful about her chess background and experience, concerns that her victory might have been achieved through methods that violated the spirit, if not the letter of their agreement. Carmen felt her hands clench involuntarily as she listened to Hawthorne systematically dismantle her daughter's triumph, using language that sounded reasonable and professional, while serving the obvious purpose of protecting Marcus Blackwood from the consequences of his own arrogance. She had seen this pattern before, had watched powerful people use legal technicalities and procedural requirements to avoid honoring commitments made to those who lacked the resources to fight back effectively. Elena listened to Hawthorne's presentation with growing anger that she struggled to keep hidden beneath a mask of polite attention. Every point he raised was technically valid, but fundamentally dishonest, designed to create doubt about the legitimacy of her victory, rather than address the simple fact that she had defeated Marcus Blackwood in a fair contest witnessed by multiple observers. The $10 million that had seemed so real the previous evening was being transformed into an abstraction, something that existed only in theory, rather than practice. When Hawthorne finished his presentation and opened his briefcase to withdraw a document that he described as a reasonable settlement offer, Elena felt something crystallize inside her chest. The paper he slid across their kitchen table offered her $50,000 in exchange for signing an agreement that would characterize the previous evening's events as a demonstration rather than a legitimate wager, effectively erasing her victory and allowing Marcus to avoid both financial loss and public embarrassment. The settlement offer was simultaneously insulting and revealing, confirming Elena's suspicion that Marcus had no intention of honoring their agreement, while also demonstrating his fear that the story of his defeat might cause lasting damage to his reputation. $50,000 was simultaneously more money than Elena's family had ever possessed, and a fraction of what she had legitimately won, a sum calculated to tempt her while also emphasizing her powerlessness to claim what was rightfully hers. Elena looked at the document for a long moment, then raised her eyes to meet Hawthorne's gaze directly. Her voice was calm when she spoke, but Carmen could hear the steel underneath her daughter's polite tone. Elena declined the settlement offer with language that was respectful but unambiguous, making it clear that she intended to hold Marcus accountable for the full terms of their original agreement, regardless of whatever legal obstacles he might attempt to construct. Hawthorne's demeanor shifted slightly as he realized that Elena was not going to be intimidated into accepting a fraction of what she had won. His smile became more strained, his voice slightly less conciliatory, as he explained the challenges that Elena would face in attempting to collect on an informal wager against someone with Marcus's resources and legal representation. The subtext was clear: she could try to fight, but the battle would be expensive, lengthy and ultimately futile given the disparity in their respective positions. After Hawthorne left, carrying his rejected settlement offer and his revised assessment of Elena's likely resistance, Carmen sat across from her daughter and tried to find words that would adequately address their situation. Elena had won a chess game but found herself facing an entirely different kind of contest, one where the rules were written by people like Marcus Blackwood and enforced by systems designed to protect wealth rather than justice. Carmen understood that Elena's victory had made her dangerous to people who depended on the assumption that natural hierarchies existed and should be respected. By defeating Marcus so decisively, Elena had challenged not just his individual superiority, but the entire framework of beliefs that allowed people like him to justify their privileges and dismiss the capabilities of people like her. The legal challenges were just the beginning. Elena had made herself a target for everyone who needed to believe that social position accurately reflected merit and ability. The next wave of complications arrived in the form of a phone call from Elena's manager at the bookstore where she had worked for the past 2 years. David Morrison had always been supportive of Elena's academic ambitions and had arranged her work schedule to accommodate her school requirements, but his voice carried a tension that Elena had never heard before, as he explained that corporate headquarters had received complaints about her employment and requested that she take an extended leave of absence while they reviewed her situation. Elena knew without asking that the complaints were connected to her newfound notoriety and the implications that her victory carried about the capabilities of people from her background. The bookstore catered to an affluent clientele who might feel uncomfortable being served by someone who had publicly challenged their assumptions about the natural order of intelligence and achievement. Her presence had become a liability, a reminder that the help possessed minds and ambitions that extended beyond their designated roles. The loss of her job struck Elena harder than the legal challenges because it affected her immediate ability to support herself and contribute to her family's expenses. The chess victory that was supposed to provide financial security had instead cost her the modest but reliable income that she had depended on for everything from school supplies to helping with rent. Marcus's revenge was already taking shape, she realized, using systems and pressure points that didn't require direct confrontation, but achieved the same goal of punishing her for her audacity. Carmen watched her daughter process this latest setback and felt the familiar rage that had sustained her through decades of similar injustices. She had seen this pattern countless times. People like them were allowed to succeed only as long as their achievements didn't threaten the comfort of people like Marcus. Only as long as they stayed within boundaries defined by others and accepted victories that didn't challenge existing power structures. Elena's crime wasn't winning a chess game, it was winning too decisively and too publicly, in a way that made pretending she was inferior impossible. The media attention that had seemed exciting in the morning began to take on more troubling dimensions as the day progressed. Elena discovered that several news outlets were running background pieces that focused more on her family's financial situation and immigrant background than on her chess skills or the circumstances of her victory. The coverage transformed her triumph into a story about poverty and social climbing, emphasizing her outsider status rather than her intellectual capabilities. One particularly disturbing article included quotes from unnamed sources at her high school who questioned whether Elena had received appropriate assistance with her academic work, suggesting that her grades and chess achievements might not accurately reflect her individual abilities. The implications were clear. Elena was being portrayed as someone who had succeeded through help and luck rather than merit, someone whose victory over Marcus should be viewed with skepticism rather than admiration. Elena read these articles with growing dismay, recognizing the same pattern of delegitimization that she had observed whenever people from her background achieved anything significant. The goal wasn't simply to discredit her specific achievements, but to reinforce broader assumptions about the kinds of people who deserved to be taken seriously and the kinds who should be viewed as anomalies or exceptions that proved rather than challenged existing rules. Carmen found herself screening all incoming calls and visitors, trying to protect Elena from the worst aspects of the media circus, while also gathering information about their legal options for enforcing the original wager. She contacted legal aid offices and community advocacy groups, searching for lawyers who might be willing to take on Marcus Blackwood, despite the obvious challenges such a case would present. Most of the responses were sympathetic but discouraging, emphasizing the difficulty of enforcing informal agreements against defendants with unlimited legal resources. The first potentially helpful contact came from an unexpected source. Sarah Chen, the daughter of the investor who had witnessed Elena's victory, called to express her support and offer assistance in connecting Elena with lawyers who specialized in high-stakes commercial litigation. Sarah was a recent law school graduate who had been following the story with personal interest, understanding that Elena's treatment reflected broader patterns of discrimination that affected anyone who didn't fit traditional expectations about success and capability. Sarah explained that her father had been deeply impressed by Elena's chess performance and was troubled by Marcus's apparent attempt to avoid honoring their agreement. Chen Wei had built his fortune by recognizing talent and potential in unexpected places, and he viewed Elena's situation as both an injustice and a business opportunity. Sarah was authorized to offer Elena access to legal representation that would be funded by her father's foundation, ensuring that financial resources wouldn't determine the outcome of any legal proceedings. Elena felt a surge of hope as she listened to Sarah's offer, recognizing that serious legal representation might actually allow her to challenge Marcus's attempt to escape the consequences of his defeat. The prospect of fighting back against the systems that were trying to erase her victory felt both terrifying and essential, a way of validating not just her own worth, but the potential of everyone who had ever been dismissed based on circumstances rather than capabilities. The legal strategy that emerged from Elena's first meeting with her new attorneys was both straightforward and complex. The straightforward part involved documenting the circumstances of the wager and gathering testimony from witnesses who could confirm the terms of the original agreement. The complex part involved anticipating and countering the various strategies that Marcus's legal team would likely employ to discredit Elena's victory and avoid payment. Elena's lead attorney, Margaret Walsh, was a seasoned litigator who had built her reputation by taking on powerful defendants in cases that other lawyers considered unwinnable. Walsh explained that Marcus would likely attempt to characterize Elena as either a fraud who had misrepresented her background or a pawn who had been used by others to embarrass him for reasons unrelated to chess. Either narrative would allow him to avoid honoring their agreement while also minimizing the threat that Elena's victory posed to his reputation and worldview. The preparation for legal battle required Elena to document every aspect of her chess education and competitive history, gathering evidence that would establish her legitimate qualifications and refute any claims that her victory had been achieved through deception or outside assistance. Elena spent days collecting score sheets from tournament games, obtaining statements from chess coaches and opponents, and providing detailed explanations of her study methods and theoretical knowledge. The process of defending her legitimacy felt degrading to Elena in ways that the original wager never had. She was being forced to prove that she deserved the victory that everyone had witnessed, to justify achievements that would never have been questioned if she had come from a different background. The assumption seemed to be that her success required explanation while Marcus's expected dominance needed none, despite the fact that his defeat had been absolute and undeniable. Carmen watched her daughter navigate these challenges with a mixture of pride and heartbreak, seeing Elena forced to mature rapidly as she confronted systems designed to protect people like Marcus from the consequences of their failures. The teenager who had approached the chessboard with nervous excitement was being transformed into someone who understood that talent and determination weren't sufficient to overcome entrenched privileges and prejudices. The media narrative began to shift slightly as more details about Elena's background and chess achievements became public. Several chess organizations issued statements confirming her tournament results and rating improvements, while coaches and opponents provided testimonials about her dedication and analytical abilities.
The portrayal of Elena as an unqualified challenger began to give way to grudging acknowledgement of her legitimate chess credentials, though questions about the enforceability of informal wagers remained prominent in most coverage. Marcus himself maintained public silence during this period, allowing his legal representatives to shape the narrative while avoiding direct statements that might be used against him in court.
His strategy appeared to focus on characterizing the entire situation as a misunderstanding rather than a deliberate attempt to avoid honoring a legitimate debt, presenting himself as a victim of circumstances rather than the architect of Elena's difficulties. The chess community's response to the controversy revealed interesting divisions about class, opportunity, and the nature of intellectual achievement. Some prominent players and coaches rallied to Elena's support, recognizing her victory as evidence that talent could emerge from unexpected backgrounds and deserved recognition regardless of social position. Others expressed skepticism about informal wagers and suggested that Elena should have been satisfied with the honor of defeating such a prominent opponent rather than pursuing financial compensation. Elena found herself becoming a symbol for debates that extended far beyond chess, representing different perspectives about merit, opportunity, and social mobility in contemporary society. Her supporters viewed her as proof that traditional barriers could be overcome through individual achievement, while her critics saw her as someone who was trying to claim rewards that she hadn't truly earned through proper channels and established procedures. The psychological pressure of serving as a symbol for larger social conflicts was perhaps more challenging for Elena than the legal battle itself. Every aspect of her behavior was scrutinized for evidence that would support different narratives about her character and motivations, making it impossible for her to simply be a teenager who had won a chess game and wanted to collect her legitimate winnings. Carmen struggled to provide Elena with emotional support, while also dealing with her own stress about their deteriorating financial situation. The loss of Elena's job had created immediate budgetary pressures, while the legal battle required time and energy that prevented Elena from seeking other employment. The $10 million that should have resolved their financial concerns had instead created new forms of instability and uncertainty. The community response to Elena's situation revealed the complex dynamics that surrounded issues of class and achievement in their neighborhood. Some neighbors and friends offered unwavering support, viewing Elena's battle as a fight for justice that reflected their own experiences with systemic discrimination. Others expressed concern that Elena was being manipulated by outside interests or suggested that she should accept whatever settlement Marcus might offer, rather than risk losing everything in a protracted legal battle. Elena's former teachers found themselves being contacted by reporters and investigators, seeking information about her academic performance and personal character. Most provided supportive statements that confirmed Elena's intelligence and work ethic, but several expressed surprise at her chess achievements and questioned whether they had adequately recognized her potential during her time in their classes. The retrospective analysis of Elena's academic record became another battleground where different parties sought evidence to support their preferred narratives about her capabilities and legitimacy. The chess training facility where Elena had occasionally studied became an unexpected focal point when reporters discovered that she had used their equipment without paying standard membership fees. The facility's director, Robert Kim, found himself forced to explain the informal arrangements that allowed dedicated students with limited financial resources to access training opportunities, arrangements that were now being characterized as evidence of either charitable support that Elena should acknowledge or preferential treatment that might have provided unfair advantages. Elena's relationship with her high school chess team became similarly complicated as former teammates were questioned about her role and contributions. Some supported her unreservedly, providing detailed accounts of her dedication and analytical abilities, while others seemed uncomfortable with the attention and suggested that Elena's current situation was too different from their shared experiences for them to provide meaningful insights. The psychological toll of constant scrutiny began to show in Elena's behavior and demeanor as the legal proceedings moved toward formal initiation. She became more guarded in her interactions with reporters and more careful about her public statements, recognizing that every word might be interpreted as evidence for competing narratives about her character and motivations. The spontaneous confidence that had characterized her chess play was being replaced by calculated caution that reflected her growing understanding of the stakes involved in her battle with Marcus. Carmen noticed that Elena was having difficulty sleeping and had lost weight during the weeks following her victory, signs that the stress of their situation was affecting her physical health as well as her emotional well-being. The triumph that should have provided security and opportunity was instead creating new forms of pressure and vulnerability that neither of them had anticipated or prepared to handle. The legal discovery process began to reveal the extent of Marcus's resources and his determination to avoid honoring their agreement. His legal team had assembled extensive files on Elena's background, family history, and academic record, searching for any evidence that might discredit her victory or provide grounds for characterizing the wager as invalid. The investigation was thorough and invasive, treating Elena like a suspected criminal rather than the winner of a legitimate contest. Elena reviewed documents that Marcus's investigators had gathered about her family's immigration history, her mother's employment records, and even her childhood academic performance, evidence of a comprehensive effort to find vulnerabilities that could be exploited in court or in public opinion. The realization that powerful people could marshal such resources to investigate and potentially destroy anyone who challenged them was both educational and terrifying for Elena. The formal legal proceedings began with motions and counter-motions that established the basic framework for their dispute, while also revealing the sophisticated strategies that both sides would employ. Marcus's team argued that informal wagers lacked legal enforceability and that Elena had misrepresented her qualifications, while Elena's attorneys focused on the witnessed nature of their agreement and the undeniable fact of her victory. The initial filings suggested that the case would become a broader examination of assumptions about merit, opportunity, and social position rather than a simple contract dispute. As the legal battle intensified and media attention remained focused on their situation, Elena began to understand that her chess victory had transformed her from an invisible member of the serving class into a public figure whose every action carried symbolic weight. The transition was disorienting and exhausting, requiring her to develop new skills for managing attention and pressure, while also continuing to prepare for legal proceedings that would determine not just her financial future, but her place in the ongoing narrative about talent, achievement, and social mobility in contemporary society. The courtroom filled with an unusual mixture of chess enthusiasts, business reporters, and community advocates who understood that Elena Martinez versus Marcus Blackwood had evolved beyond a simple contract dispute into something resembling a public referendum on merit and privilege. Judge Patricia Reeves presided over proceedings that carried weight far exceeding their legal parameters, aware that her decisions would influence how society viewed conflicts between established power and emerging talent. Elena sat at the plaintiff's table wearing a navy blue suit that Carmen had purchased specifically for the trial, her posture erect and her expression composed despite the anxiety that churned beneath her professional demeanor. Margaret Walsh had spent weeks preparing Elena for this moment, conducting mock examinations and reviewing potential lines of attack that Marcus's defense team might pursue. Elena had learned to speak in precise legal language while maintaining the authenticity that made her story compelling to observers who might otherwise dismiss her claims. Marcus occupied the defendant's table with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to prevailing in disputes through superior resources rather than superior arguments. His legal team had assembled a formidable array of documentation and expert witnesses designed to cast doubt on every aspect of Elena's victory, from the circumstances of their original wager to the legitimacy of her chess qualifications. The strategy was comprehensive and ruthless, reflecting Marcus's determination to avoid both financial loss and public acknowledgement of his defeat. Margaret Walsh's opening statement painted Elena's story in broad strokes that emphasized themes of fairness and accountability, while avoiding language that might alienate jurors uncomfortable with explicit discussions of class and privilege. She described Elena as a dedicated student whose chess abilities had been developed through years of disciplined study, someone who had accepted a challenge issued by Marcus himself and fulfilled her part of their agreement completely. The wager represented a contract that Marcus was now attempting to escape through technicalities and character assassination rather than honest dispute resolution. Richard Hawthorne's opening for the defense focused on the informal nature of their agreement and the unrealistic expectations that Elena had developed based on what he characterized as a casual conversation rather than a binding commitment. He suggested that Elena had misunderstood the social dynamics of the situation, interpreting politeness and accommodation as serious business negotiations. The defense narrative portrayed Elena as either naive or opportunistic, someone who was either genuinely confused about the nature of their interaction or deliberately attempting to extract payment for what had been intended as entertainment. The first witness called by Elena's legal team was Chen Wei, whose testimony provided crucial context about the circumstances surrounding the original wager. Speaking with the authority that came from decades of successful business negotiations, Chen Wei confirmed that Marcus had issued a serious challenge and that all parties present had understood the financial stakes involved. His testimony was particularly effective because it came from someone whose wealth and business acumen made it impossible to dismiss him as biased toward Elena based on shared social position. Chen Wei's cross-examination revealed the defense strategy's fundamental weakness, their inability to explain why a man of Marcus's sophistication would make such statements unless he intended them to be taken seriously. Hawthorne's attempts to characterize Chen Wei's testimony as misremembered or influenced by subsequent events appeared desperate when contrasted with Chen Wei's detailed and consistent account of the evening's events. The elderly investor's presence in Elena's corner also provided implicit validation of her character and abilities from someone whose judgment Marcus's own associates respected. Elena's testimony represented the emotional centerpiece of the trial, her opportunity to explain her background, training, and approach to chess while also addressing the various attacks that the defense had launched against her credibility. Margaret Walsh guided Elena through a chronological account of her chess education that demonstrated both dedication and legitimate achievement, using specific examples and documented results to counter suggestions that her abilities had been exaggerated or misrepresented. Elena described her discovery of chess as a child, her years of study using library books and borrowed equipment, and her gradual improvement through tournament participation and analysis of master games. Her testimony was detailed and technical, demonstrating knowledge that could only have been acquired through extensive study rather than casual familiarity. She spoke about specific games she had analyzed, opening theories she had mastered, and tactical patterns she had practiced until they became second nature. The cross-examination that followed was aggressive and personal, with Hawthorne attempting to portray Elena as someone whose achievements were inflated and whose victory over Marcus had been achieved through luck rather than skill. Elena responded to each attack with calm precision, providing specific details that supported her claims while avoiding defensive reactions that might suggest uncertainty or deception. Her performance under pressure demonstrated the same analytical abilities that had enabled her chess victory, transforming what was intended as character assassination into validation of her competence. Marcus's own testimony proved problematic for the defense despite extensive preparation and coaching. While he successfully conveyed the impression of someone who took chess seriously and possessed legitimate expertise, he struggled to explain his decision-making process during their game and his inability to recognize the strength of Elena's position until it was too late for recovery. His attempts to characterize Elena's victory as fortunate rather than skillful were undermined by chess experts who analyzed the game and confirmed that Elena's play had demonstrated sophisticated understanding of complex strategic concepts.
The defense's expert witness testimony focused on statistical analysis of chess outcomes and the rarity of victories by lower-rated players against significantly stronger opponents. Dr. Michael Foster, a chess researcher and statistician, presented data suggesting that Elena's victory fell within the range of results that might be expected to occur occasionally through variance rather than systematic skill differences.
His analysis was thorough and professionally presented, creating reasonable doubt about whether Elena's victory proved superiority or simply represented a fortunate outcome in a single contest. Margaret Walsh's cross-examination of Dr. Foster revealed the limitations of purely statistical analysis when applied to individual contests between specific opponents. She demonstrated that Foster's data included many games where rating differences were based on limited or outdated information, situations that didn't apply to Elena and Marcus's contest. More importantly, Walsh showed that Foster had not actually analyzed the moves and decisions made during their specific game, relying instead on abstract probabilities that ignored the concrete evidence of Elena's strategic competence. The most damaging testimony for Marcus came from an unexpected source, Dr. Jennifer Liu, a cognitive psychologist who had studied decision-making under pressure and the psychological factors that influenced competitive performance. Dr. Liu had reviewed recordings of the chess match and analyzed both players' behavior and decision-making patterns throughout the game. Her testimony revealed that Elena had demonstrated consistent analytical thinking, while Marcus had shown signs of emotional decision-making that suggested he had been psychologically unprepared for serious competition. Dr. Liu's analysis indicated that Marcus's poor performance reflected overconfidence and inadequate respect for his opponent, rather than Elena's exceptional play or fortunate circumstances. She described how Marcus's body language and move timing had revealed his assumption of easy victory, leading to careless analysis and strategic mistakes that Elena had exploited with systematic precision. The psychological portrait that emerged from Dr. Liu's testimony was devastating for Marcus's credibility, suggesting that his defeat had been earned rather than accidental. The defense attempted to counter Dr. Liu's testimony by questioning the reliability of psychological analysis based on limited observations and the appropriateness of drawing broad conclusions from a single competitive situation. However, their cross-examination was undermined by Dr. Liu's extensive credentials and the specific documented behavioral patterns she had identified throughout the game. Her analysis provided scientific validation for what many observers had intuitively concluded: Elena had outplayed Marcus through superior preparation and strategic thinking. Carmen Martinez's testimony provided crucial context about Elena's character and development, describing her daughter's dedication to chess study and the sacrifices their family had made to support Elena's intellectual pursuits. Carmen spoke about Elena's work schedule and academic achievements, painting a picture of someone whose success reflected discipline and determination rather than luck or external assistance. Her testimony was particularly effective because it came from someone who had observed Elena's development over many years and could speak to the authenticity of her achievements. The defense's cross-examination of Carmen attempted to suggest that she might have exaggerated Elena's abilities, or that external assistance might have contributed to Elena's chess development in ways that the family had not acknowledged. These attacks backfired by revealing the callous assumptions underlying the defense strategy, with Hawthorne appearing to suggest that working-class families were inherently unreliable witnesses to their own experiences and achievements. Elena's high school chess coach, Patricia Gomez, provided testimony that documented Elena's tournament results and rating progression over several years of competitive play. Coach Gomez described Elena as an exceptional student who had consistently performed above her rating in tournament situations, demonstrating the kind of improvement curve that indicated genuine talent rather than inflated credentials. Her testimony was supported by extensive documentation that established Elena's legitimate standing in the chess community prior to her confrontation with Marcus. The testimony of Elena's former opponents proved particularly effective in establishing the consistency of her chess abilities over time. Several players described games where Elena had demonstrated the same analytical skills and strategic understanding that had enabled her victory over Marcus. Their accounts created a pattern of competent performance that contradicted defense suggestions that her victory had been anomalous or accidental. Expert analysis of the actual chess game provided the most compelling evidence for Elena's case. International master David Rodriguez analyzed each move of their contest, explaining the strategic concepts and tactical calculations that had led to Elena's victory. Rodriguez's commentary revealed that Elena had played with remarkable consistency, making only minor inaccuracies, while Marcus had committed several significant errors that reflected inadequate analysis rather than bad luck. Rodriguez's analysis was particularly effective because it addressed the game's technical content rather than personalities or social dynamics. He demonstrated that Elena's key decisions had been objectively superior to the alternatives available, indicating genuine understanding rather than fortunate guessing. The expert testimony transformed Elena's victory from an interesting upset into a documented example of superior chess performance. The defense's attempt to present their own chess expert was undermined when their analyst, Grandmaster Robert Sterling, acknowledged under cross-examination that Elena's play had been surprisingly sophisticated and that her victory could not be attributed to Marcus's errors alone. Sterling's reluctant admission that Elena had demonstrated legitimate chess skill provided crucial validation from someone initially intended to support the defense case. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Margaret Walsh challenged Marcus to explain his strategic thinking during several critical positions from their game. Marcus's inability to provide coherent explanations for his decisions, contrasted with Elena's clear and accurate analysis of the same positions, demonstrated the competence gap that had led to his defeat. The exchange revealed Marcus as someone whose chess abilities had been inflated by his general success rather than specific expertise. Judge Reeves's handling of the proceedings reflected her understanding that the case carried implications beyond its immediate legal parameters. She allowed extensive testimony about the broader context surrounding Elena's situation while maintaining focus on the specific legal questions about contract formation and performance. Her approach suggested recognition that justice required consideration of power dynamics as well as technical legal requirements. The jury's deliberation lasted 2 days, reflecting the complexity of issues they were asked to resolve and the conflicting narratives they had heard about Elena's character and abilities. Their questions to the court focused primarily on the standards for enforcing informal agreements and the weight that should be given to witness testimony about the original wager's circumstances. The extended deliberation suggested careful consideration of evidence rather than predetermined conclusions based on social position. Elena waited for the verdict with her mother and legal team, trying to maintain composure while understanding that the jury's decision would determine not just her financial future but her standing in the ongoing debate about merit and opportunity. The 2 days of deliberation felt endless, filled with speculation and anxiety about which version of events the jurors had found most convincing. When the jury returned with their verdict, the courtroom was packed with observers who understood that they were witnessing a decision with implications extending far beyond Elena and Marcus's personal dispute. Judge Reeves called for order as the jury foreman stood to deliver findings that had been awaited by everyone who had followed the case through media coverage and social media discussions. The verdict was unambiguous. The jury found that Elena and Marcus had formed a valid contract, that Elena had fulfilled her obligations under their agreement, and that Marcus was therefore required to pay the full $10 million amount that had been agreed upon. The decision was unanimous, suggesting that the evidence had been compelling enough to overcome any initial skepticism about Elena's claims or capabilities. Elena felt her knees weaken as the verdict was read, the magnitude of her legal victory combining with relief that her character and abilities had been vindicated through the judicial process. Carmen reached for her daughter's hand, tears streaming down her face as she realized that Elena's courage in refusing the settlement offer had been justified by complete victory in their legal battle. Marcus sat motionless as the verdict was announced, his face revealing nothing of his internal reaction to a defeat that was even more complete than his chess loss had been. The jury had not simply found in Elena's favor, they had explicitly validated her account of events while implicitly rejecting the character attacks and competency challenges that had formed the foundation of his defense strategy. The judge's instructions for compliance gave Marcus 30 days to arrange payment, with additional penalties specified if he failed to meet the court-ordered deadline. Judge Reeves's tone suggested that she would not tolerate attempts to avoid or delay compliance through additional legal maneuvers, understanding that Elena's victory needed to be protected through swift and decisive enforcement. The immediate aftermath of the verdict brought a flood of media attention that transformed Elena from a local news story into a national symbol of determination and social mobility. Interview requests poured in from news programs and documentary filmmakers who wanted to explore the broader implications of her legal victory over one of the business community's most prominent figures. Elena found herself in the unfamiliar position of being sought after for her opinions and insights rather than dismissed based on her background. Marcus's response to the verdict was initially silence, followed by a brief statement expressing disappointment with the decision and respect for the legal process. His restrained reaction suggested recognition that further public battle would only amplify the damage to his reputation while providing Elena with additional platforms to discuss her victory and its broader significance. The $10 million payment arrived exactly 30 days after the verdict, transferred to Elena's newly established bank account through a process that felt surreal despite months of legal preparation.
Elena stared at the account balance on her phone screen, struggling to comprehend that the number represented not just financial security, but validation of her worth as an individual capable of competing successfully against anyone regardless of their social position. Carmen quit her job at the Blackwood Tower the day after receiving confirmation of the payment, writing a resignation letter that was professional but final. She had no interest in returning to clean floors for a man who had attempted to destroy her daughter's future, understanding that some victories required complete separation from the systems that had previously defined their lives. Her resignation was both practical and symbolic, representing the family's transition from dependency to independence. Elena's first major decision with her newfound wealth was establishing a foundation dedicated to providing chess education and competitive opportunities to young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. The Elena Martinez Foundation would offer scholarships, coaching, and equipment to students who demonstrated interest and potential but lacked the resources to pursue serious chess training. The foundation represented Elena's commitment to ensuring that other talented individuals would not face the same barriers that had complicated her own development. The foundation's first major initiative was a partnership with public schools in low-income communities, providing chess sets, instructional materials, and trained coaches to students who had never been exposed to the game's intellectual challenges and competitive rewards. Elena personally visited several schools to explain the program and encourage students to explore chess as both recreation and potential pathway to academic and professional opportunities. Elena enrolled at Columbia University as a mathematics major, having been accepted following her legal victory and the media attention that had made her academic potential widely recognized. The transition to university life required adjustment to an environment where her intelligence was expected rather than surprising, where classmates and professors treated her achievements as normal rather than exceptional for someone from her background. Carmen used part of Elena's financial success to purchase a modest house in a safe neighborhood with good schools, fulfilling dreams that had seemed impossible during their years in the cramped apartment above the corner market. The house represented stability and security that had been absent from their lives, providing Carmen with space to pursue educational opportunities that she had deferred while focusing on Elena's needs and development. The chess world's reaction to Elena's story was largely positive, with many players and coaches expressing admiration for her dedication and strategic abilities, while also recognizing the broader significance of her victory over Marcus. Several prominent chess organizations invited Elena to participate in exhibition matches and training programs, opportunities that would have been unimaginable before her legal victory established her credibility and visibility. Elena's first professional chess tournament following the legal proceedings resulted in a respectable middle-of-the-pack finish that confirmed her legitimate competitive abilities, while also demonstrating areas where continued improvement was needed. The result was satisfying because it represented authentic achievement rather than symbolic victory, proving that her success against Marcus had been based on genuine skill rather than circumstantial factors.
Marcus Blackwood's reputation suffered lasting damage from the case, with business partners and social contacts reassessing their assumptions about his judgment and character. Several major deals were cancelled or postponed as potential partners expressed concern about associating with someone whose treatment of Elena had revealed unflattering aspects of his personality and values. The financial cost of the $10 million payment was ultimately less significant than the reputational consequences of his defeat. The broader business community's reaction to Marcus's defeat was mixed, with some executives expressing sympathy for his position, while others suggested that his loss reflected poor decision-making and inadequate respect for Elena's capabilities. The case became a topic of discussion in business schools and leadership programs, used as an example of how unconscious bias and overconfidence could lead to costly mistakes. Elena's story inspired similar legal challenges in other contexts, where informal agreements had been made and subsequently disputed by parties with superior resources. Several employment and contract cases referenced Elena versus Blackwood as precedent for enforcing agreements that powerful defendants attempted to avoid through technical challenges rather than substantive disputes. The social media response to Elena's victory was overwhelmingly positive, with millions of people sharing her story as inspiration for overcoming barriers and challenging assumptions about who deserved success and recognition. Elena became an unintentional influencer, with her posts about chess strategy and educational opportunities reaching audiences far beyond the traditional chess community. Elena's relationship with publicity remained complex, as she appreciated the platform that her visibility provided, while also feeling constrained by expectations that she serve as a spokesperson for broader social issues, rather than simply pursuing her individual goals and interests. The balance between using her influence responsibly and maintaining personal autonomy required ongoing negotiation as her public profile continued to grow. Carmen's adjustment to their changed circumstances was perhaps more dramatic than Elena's, as she transitioned from decades of service work to exploring educational and professional opportunities that her previous financial situation had made impossible. Carmen enrolled in community college courses and began considering career paths that matched her intelligence and interests, rather than simply her immediate economic needs. The legal team that had represented Elena established a pro bono program dedicated to similar cases where talented individuals faced discrimination or contract violations based on prejudicial assumptions about their capabilities. Margaret Walsh's success in Elena's case generated referrals from other attorneys and advocacy groups seeking representation for clients whose achievements had been systematically undervalued or dismissed. Chen Wei's foundation expanded its mission following Elena's victory, establishing additional programs designed to identify and support exceptional talent regardless of background or social position. The foundation's work was inspired by recognition that Elena's situation was not unique, that many capable individuals faced similar barriers to recognition and opportunity based on circumstances beyond their control. Elena's university experience provided opportunities to engage with intellectual challenges that extended beyond chess while also developing networks and relationships that would support her future career goals. Her professors and classmates treated her as a serious student rather than a celebrity, allowing her to focus on academic development while gradually integrating her public recognition with her scholarly pursuits. The documentary about Elena's story, produced 18 months after her legal victory, provided comprehensive examination of the social and cultural factors that had shaped her experience while also celebrating her individual achievements and determination. The film won several awards at international festivals and generated additional discussions about merit, opportunity, and social mobility in contemporary society. Elena's second year of university brought invitations to speak at conferences and symposiums about chess education, legal justice, and overcoming adversity, opportunities that allowed her to share her insights while also learning from others who had navigated similar challenges in different fields. The speaking engagements provided additional income while also building her reputation as someone whose success story carried broader lessons about potential and achievement. The Elena Martinez Foundation's impact expanded rapidly as additional donors and corporate sponsors recognized the value of supporting chess education in underserved communities. The Foundation's programs began producing measurable results in improved academic performance and increased college enrollment among participating students, validating Elena's belief that chess could serve as a catalyst for broader educational achievement. Carmen's completion of her associate's degree represented a personal triumph that was perhaps as meaningful as Elena's legal victory, demonstrating that educational opportunities could transform lives regardless of age or previous experience. Carmen's academic success inspired other members of their community to pursue educational goals that they had previously considered impossible or impractical. Elena's chess rating continued to improve through consistent tournament play and dedicated study, reaching expert level within 2 years of her victory over Marcus. The rating improvement represented authentic achievement based on competitive results, rather than publicity or special consideration, confirming that her initial success had been based on genuine ability rather than circumstantial factors. Marcus Blackwood eventually emerged from his period of public silence to issue a comprehensive statement acknowledging his mistakes and expressing respect for Elena's achievements and character. The statement appeared genuine rather than strategic, suggesting that the experience had prompted genuine reflection about his attitudes and behaviors rather than simply damage control for his reputation. The broader impact of Elena's story continued to unfold years after her initial victory, inspiring policy changes in educational institutions and youth programs designed to identify and support exceptional talent regardless of background. Elena's success demonstrated that individual achievement could catalyze systemic changes that created opportunities for others facing similar barriers and challenges. Elena graduated from Columbia with highest honors, having been accepted to graduate programs in both mathematics and law that would provide pathways to careers combining analytical problem-solving with advocacy for social justice. Her academic success represented the natural continuation of the intellectual capabilities that had enabled her chess victory, proving that her talents extended far beyond a single domain or contest. The chess world continued to celebrate Elena as an example of how dedication and strategic thinking could overcome apparent disadvantages and achieve recognition in competitive environments. Her story became part of chess pedagogy, used by coaches and teachers to inspire students while also demonstrating the game's potential to develop analytical skills applicable to numerous other pursuits and challenges. Carmen's career transition into social work allowed her to support other families navigating educational and legal systems, drawing on her experience with Elena's situation to provide practical guidance and emotional support. Carmen's work represented a natural application of the insights and skills she had developed while supporting Elena's development and legal battle. Elena's engagement to her university classmate, David Parker, economics major who shared her interests in social justice and public policy, represented personal happiness that had been delayed but not derailed by the challenges she had faced. Their relationship was built on mutual respect and shared values rather than celebrity or financial considerations, providing Elena with emotional stability as she continued pursuing ambitious career goals. The 10-year anniversary of Elena's chess victory was marked by a celebration that brought together the legal team, witnesses and supporters who had contributed to her success. The event served as both commemoration and fundraiser for the Elena Martinez Foundation, which had grown into a national organization supporting chess education and academic achievement in hundreds of communities. Elena's reflection on her journey from Maid's daughter to national symbol emphasized the importance of individual preparation and determination, while also acknowledging the crucial support provided by allies who had recognized her potential and provided resources for her legal battle. Her story demonstrated that exceptional achievement required both personal excellence and systemic support, individual effort and collective recognition. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.